Well, a happy Friday to you all. Today we will dive into the first chapter where we explain economics as the essence of motion. Sure, we can move things physically or phonetically, but also telekinetically where mountains may be moved with many and pebbles moved by one. Bill further explains chapter 1 for us now.
Chapter 1. Week 1. Essence of motion. To determine how an individual is moved, which may ignite a reciprocal chain reaction in others, we must identify the source and define its essence, because without seeking the source, actions are based off reactions as the blind lead the blind. My mother would always tell me that there was no such thing as standing still, because you are either moving forward with the rest of the world or falling behind, so standing still is actually moving backward. 9 times out of 10 we exceed merely making progress toward what we feel is good. For some it's used cars. For others it's politics, and yet for others it may be the word of the Lord. We are all selling something we believe in, and the more experience we gain is the more profitable we become as we build up potential energy. Without potential energy there would be nothing kinetic, so no cars to sell, no party to lead and no word to preach, but we do, and there are. Transforming potential energy into kinetic becomes as easy as altering one's mindset, but whether or not it is effective depends on the amount of potential transformed, where the transformation is what we call power. As the world moves forward with or without us, the power which is now kinetic affects our surroundings for the better, as we would fall into insignificance without it. Our initial attempts at controlling our surroundings are through physical contact, with phonetic kinesis being second, and then as we mature, we make attempts at telekinesis. As we are mostly driven by what we see, controlling what we make, we use physical contact, adding, subtracting, and scaling up or down force as necessary. When there is not enough force for a desired outcome, we add physical force to balance or overcome an obstacle, and economic influence to better situations in our favor. We even reiterate what verbiage or slogan is associated with the task at hand to further motivate staff. Sometimes force must be subtracted to allow the freedom liberty affords to shape our motion, which is protocol to a certain extent. We multiply and divide, scaling up and down kinetic energy and applying the appropriate amount of force where necessary. Physical contact is the most primitive form of movement as well as the most limited, and it should never be used on another unless absolutely necessary. There are other ways of moving mountains to markets, for their sale. We use phonetic kinesis, if physical force is ineffective, to coerce those within the reach of our voice toward a project for a mutual benefit. Language leads to vocal persuasion and an intellectual oration that encourages the motivation necessary to complete tasks and achieve goals. With language, speech is a precursor to tone, because tone is a language in itself, when circumstances play a factor. And grammar is the attribute of language which accents our education. All language is an attempt at vocal persuasion where melody is combined with a rhythm to produce a unique harmony. Language is such so that it becomes a joy to present and hear, where it can only be called intellectual oration. This oratory, using proper syntax, becomes repetitious, produces a certain rhetoric, and adds to the potential energy we have in our speech. More often than not, we reap what we sow. Both segments of the previous sentence show where the syntax is acceptable, and the rhetoric is true. When used, this phonetic kinesis moves men, women, and children to a certain tune, like those under the spell of the piper, hypnotized. When we say move in such a manner as to persuade, it's much easier to get what we want accomplished. But there is even yet another way to prevent the opposite, as yelling can be a form of violent speech which, when dominant, verbal abuse. Speak as least as possible, unless repeating something which was once true. The most effective and furthest from physical contact is the age-old act of telekinesis, as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet inspires a neoclassical style. So, we take such a position, pointed in a direction and delivered at such and such trajectory to produce a written model and mental picture of what is required. We have to know or be persuaded, document that position as best as possible, and distribute written information to form a body of those who had seen a no smoking sign for the first time. For example, of course, if we see Coke 1,776 times and Pepsi 1,492 times, we'll more likely choose the former because of familiarity. This position needs direction, because however many protons this element has is its potential power, which must be written, being based on law, tradition, or the arts. This position is not directed as such without consideration for its trajectory in mind. The trajectory is determined by the economic potential that funds the quantity of the distribution, and distance, scope, and magnitude of economic gain sown from the produce will be documented and compared to ensure actions are beneficial. By proving our positions beneficial and statistically up in the polls, we suggest movement one way or another. Since we all essentially want what is good, the motion we intend will also be good, where we physically move, verbally persuade, and intellectually impose our version of reality on others. The plan may not be the best, but for lack of a better alternative, we see first as better and biggest as best. But we are neither first nor biggest. Does that mean we should discontinue our candidacy, support whichever party we feel most dominate, and take the chance of losing at the polls under another's auspices? We have all our lives to sit back and allow the majority to feed, clothe, and house us, with the economic potential they distribute as charity, just enough, so much so the majority of the minority won't want to rebel against the system. This movement that we propose is not physical nor verbal, but a detailed plan and roadmap to success, where the essence of motion is due to an alternate perception of reality. In this reality we are good and right in our pursuit of economic potential, which translates into political power, as those with represent those without and tax them equally and accordingly.
This concludes the reading in chapter 1. If there are any questions from the audience, we will entertain them now, whereafter we will dismiss until Monday. We hope you have a good weekend and are prepared to tackle Chapter 2 on Monday. Thank you for your time and consideration.